Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
Hello, everyone. Not much has changed. In some regards, things may have gotten worse on a day-to-day basis, if you can imagine that, simply driven by a lack of discretion based on what comes out of people's mouths. We don't seem to think about what we say before we say it. But before we get into this, I just want to mention very quickly, we are sponsored by Instacart and Buzzsprout. I suggest you take a look at the both of them. They're both legitimate and user-friendly. As you look at the condition of the country, it is becoming more and more unstable as the days click off. You wonder what's driving this. What is the political agenda? What's the end game? So to break it down in a more simplistic thought process, who is benefiting or who is supposed to benefit from 5 million people illegally crossing into this country, some of whom are on a terrorist watch list, about 1 million of them whom have come in undetected. Who is that benefiting? Who is that being done for? And it sounds like a rhetorical question, but it really isn't. If someone has the cojones to try to engage me and explain to me what that is about, I'm willing to listen. As I've said before, and I'll remind everybody that your FBI Director, Christopher Wray, about a month ago in Senate hearings in Washington, D.C., cited the fact that our southern border is a threat to our national security. What did it translate to? Absolutely nothing. We're not doing anything to address it. You're hearing on a daily basis from Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, Customs Immigration, the fentanyl flooding into this country. That's in candy now. What are we doing about it? Absolutely nothing. Who is that supposed to be benefiting, by the way? You look at the condition of your major cities. These policies that basically allow individuals to operate illegally with impunity. Who is supposed to be benefiting from that policy? I'm just curious. This foreign policy, which is becoming more and more problematic, although most Americans don't realize that because you're busy struggling through this economy and worrying about taking care of your children, gassing your car, getting to work, et cetera, et cetera. We're looking at a money pit called Ukraine, right? We're looking at escalation going on there, which, to be honest with you, this would have been averted if this president had merely staged some assets the minute Putin had staged assets on the border of Ukraine. And for example, he put like 100,000 troops there. The United States, along with the 27 NATO countries positioned in Europe, should have started introducing assets and maybe even troops to give him some idea that this would not go gently into the night. Didn't do that. Afghanistan's pullout. Embarrassing, shameful what we did to the women and the young girls there. Don't know what to say. Who's benefiting from shutting down the Keystone Pipeline? I'm just curious. Who is that supposed to benefit? Okay, who reaped the fruition of that? Now we're attacking the oil companies because they're making up for lost time, which happened during the pandemic, right? They took a profit hit dramatically because people stopped driving. Who benefited or who's supposed to benefit by this government spending $5 trillion, which is why, and this is really where it gets pretty interesting, you have an 8.2% inflation rate, but if you go buy a dozen eggs, it's 38% higher than it was in 2021. Or cereal, 17% higher. I mentioned cereal because our children eat cereal. I don't see any 8.2 inflation rate, and I know there's a whole formula that they calculate, all the intellectuals, how they come about this 8.2 inflation rate. Gasoline certainly hasn't gone up 8.2%. Let's try more like 60% plus. And it's about to go higher because Saudi Arabia threw us a curveball. And it was all predicated on this man's lack of discretion based on how he, I would say, outlined the new king there, the new guy in charge, right? In one breath we criticize Trump for his lack of discretion, and duly so, but there can't be two sets of rules, which is what's just pervasive in this country. Something interesting I found was I think it was on CNN, they were worrying about finding 12 jurors in a Trump trial that didn't hate him. He's supposed to go in without bias. We're losing the country. All right, our veterans are killing themselves at a rate of like either 22 or 25 a day, and we're worried about Donald Trump again. And what's so really tragic, folks, and I guess it isn't tragic, I'm just being cute with you, is that after this election cycle in November, a week from today, this whole thing about the January 6th hearings are going to become what we call a moot point. They will go no further. And for everyone that has to vote, I'm never going to be the person to tell you who to vote for. I just simply ask you, take a look at your condition of your country. That's all. And ask yourself, who put us on that path? And divorce yourself from your politics and your agenda and all the things you hold so dear, like your power and your control and your esteem and any of these little personality deficiencies that impede your judgment. And think about the young people here, guys, because that's who's going to be adversely affected as they are now and in the future. We're on a collision course right now. This country is unstable and it's unsafe. If you don't believe that, take a look at what happened in Chicago last night or Philadelphia or any other number of cities. And the really tragic part of this discussion is this once vibrant Democratic Party is clearly broken. They're misguided. And I keep telling people this is a minuscule percentage of the population steering the course of this country. I listened to someone come out and say that there are 300 repeat offenders in the city of New York that are creating all this crime and mayhem and havoc and making people fearful to go out at night and have dinner. 8.6 million people in the city of New York and its 5 boroughs. Okay? And 300 people are rocking your boat. Who's running that city? And I point not only to the police department, because the police department basically works at the behest of the mayor's office, but who's running the city, folks? I didn't fall off the back of an Apple truck. I'm not the sharpest guy where they keep sharp tools. I realize that, but a lot of logic and common sense and things that stare you directly in the eyes do not escape me. 300 people, they're claiming, causing all that havoc. I keep telling you, this is a minuscule percentage of the population that is destroying the fiber and the fabric of this country. I do want to say something else that I constantly bring up that no one really seems to latch on to. We have grown to perhaps a population that we're having a hard time managing it. We're busy taking care of people crossing the border illegally. We're building accommodations for them at a place called Randall's Island, which is actually the fire academy for the New York City Fire Department. There's only one way in and out. That's the bus from 126th Street and Lexington Avenue. Flat screen TVs, Xboxes, comfortable living, cuisine, similar to where they came from. And we have homeless people and mentally ill people in the streets we're not taking care of in that capacity. Guys, this is staring you in the eyes. It's time for a change. And I know Barack Obama threw that expression around quite a bit, about change. Unfortunately, Mr. Obama, contrary to what everybody would like to think, started this process we're living right now. He decided to redefine America. He embraced this whole progressive movement. You are now inheriting that. And I'm not anti-Barack. I voted for him in 2008. So I'm going to get some feedback on that, but I could tell you why. It has to do with the vice presidential pick by the Republicans with John McCain. Another, I would say, ill-conceived notion, failed to vet. By the way, at your borders, we're not vetting people. Not at the volume they're coming across. Sorry, if they're telling you we are, we're just not. And now we're going to see an uptick of crime just because of people illegal in this country that are trying to make their way through the day. And by the way, we're sending many of them to the Bronx, which is like sending them to school of crime. I guarantee you that the majority or 99% of my listeners do not understand the scope of the problem in the Bronx. It's like a shooting gallery. It's ridiculous. We also don't want to talk about it. We are at a crossroad right now, and in a week we're going to come to that threshold, and it's going to decide whether or not we continue as the country we once were, or we can continue to go down this rabbit hole. It's imperative that you get out and vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm going to tell you, separate yourself from your conventional thinking and your politics. It's getting us nowhere, guys. It's getting worse every day. And by the way, let's thank Hillary Clinton once again for undermining the 2024 election cycle. She so boldly came out and said that the extreme right radicals were already planning to I guess, compromised the election. For any of you that didn't listen to Elliot Ackerman, I suggest you do. Listen to what that translates to. Today we have a guest, David Beckemeyer. He's the current host of Outrage Overload, a podcast about our unhealthy relationship with the media industry. Boy, is he right on the money. Root of the problem in the country. He's a former tech exec, investor, and advisor. He now focuses his time on our unhealthy relationship to outrage porn, messages designed to evoke outrage. Shortly after this break, we're going to come right back and get into this discussion. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and as I mentioned a moment ago, we have David Beckemeyer with us right now, and he's has his own podcast, and it really traverses this unhealthy relationship we have with the media, which I've told you redundantly is at the root of the cause of the disruption and dysfunction of this country. They're creating your narrative and your optic. It's inescapable. How are you, David?
I'm doing great. Good to see you, Lou.
And what are you outraged about, buddy?
Well, I guess I'm trying not to be outraged. That's one of my main objectives of doing all this was kind of I reached my own outrage limit. I was maxed out, and so I kind of started looking at this from see if I can kick a new perspective on all this, take a step back, and so that's kind of become my mission now is to. Although I'm still addicted to it, right? I still go for it, and I still look for it.
I have to ask you this question, David, and it's an important question. I volunteer. I'm 70 years old, so I can only say it to you this way. I grew up in a different America. With the advent of this 24-hour news cycle, this country took a very bad turn. It's literally out of control, and they don't seem to understand this word called responsibility. I tell people all the time, before you say something, think about what you're going to say, understand how words can damage, and what it will translate to. That doesn't seem to apply to them. And what I always come out and say is that it's the only institution I'm aware of that has no oversight. Every place else on the planet, in this country especially, if you breathe wrong, we have a reason to come after you. The media is destroying our country. There's no other way to say it. I don't know what your feeling is on that, but I'm curious to hear it.
Yeah, well, I absolutely feel like they're letting us down. I think, and
why are you being so nice, David? Hold on a second. Why are you being so nice?
Well, again, it's sort of that the new me is trying not to be, the screaming, raging fool all the time. But they're letting us down. They've had, like you say, that the 24-hour news cycle has been, some of it. I don't think that's everything, but that's a huge part of it. And then there's the competition from the social media and all these alternative sites, and they're all just vying for our attention. They're vying for our money. They're vying for our votes, and everybody's competing for that. And it seems like it's caused us to just keep stepping up, or caused them to keep stepping up. And like you say, the sort of responsibility is not really there. There's the incentive structures, sort of perverted, and like you say, there's not really a lot of accountability. I mean, the accountability is more like, they're not allowed to say a bad word or whatever. But I mean, there isn't really a lot of accountability to the better of society, I think that the ownership and things like that. I mean, like I say, the incentive structure is just so broken. There's such a fight for our attention that it's hard not to. And so to some degree, if we keep going for it, you have to blame us a little bit.
Yeah, I think we do have to take some responsibility. But my perception of this problem is that it's at the scope or scale that they can even influence our thinking almost on every topic that's available for you to think about. And even if you're an elected official, whether or not they decide to get your message out, they have this kind of crazy power. And if we go back a few months ago during this year that we were going to have the misinformation squad or the disinformation squad, I was a proponent of that, to be very candid with you, because I think that's a universal concept, right? It has to be applied without, partiality. And I think we happen to need that. But for some reason, that seems to have gone away. I bring this up to you because I think this is really interesting about a lack of responsibility with people that purport themselves to be journalists. I'm listening to Jonathan Capehart on a Sunday morning on MSNBC, and through his entire degradation of, mainstream America, he goes off on this tangent about crazy white people. These are his words, not mine. And why he's afraid of crazy white people, and his friends were afraid of crazy white people. That's protected under the Constitution. You can't yell fire in a movie theater, but you're allowed to incite the public? I mean, can somebody not see we're right on the same track here? Or Maxine Waters, who comes out and says, disrupt, interfere with anybody that supports Donald Trump. Is that what our elected officials are about? And the media plays that. The thing people haven't figured out about this whole thing about cancellation, you can only be canceled if the media tells you you've been canceled. You realize that, right? If they don't carry that message, nobody gets canceled because there's no other vehicle to carry the message. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, there's certainly no other vehicle that scale. And I think when they complain about people's going off to alternative news sources, I mean, they're to blame for that because they have created this loss of credibility, right? If they're kind of doing that sort of thing, and it's no wonder people go to alternative news sources if, you sort of lose faith in or lose trust. I mean, it's a little Pollyanna to say that there was some past where everything was great in the media. I do think that there was kind of the Walter Cronkite days were probably the zenith of that, right? I mean, I think you kind of had Walter Cronkite at the end of the day to tell you, oh, don't, this crazy thing what you thought earlier in the day was dumb. So now I'm going to tell you kind of the real facts. And we kind of went, okay, and we went along with that. But it's a little Pollyanna to say that we ever had this perfect news environment. I mean, this kind of weird news. I mean, there was partisan news, back in newspaper days. I mean, they literally would sort of say they're partisan, right? They're saying, I'm for this candidate, and I'm going to just post stories about that. If you were lucky in your town, there was 2 newspapers, so you could have, sort of a couple of different views. But in some towns, it wasn't like there was only one newspaper, and they pretty much took a view. So we have to put that in perspective a little bit. But this power that they have now, especially when you throw in social media and everything else into it, then yeah, I mean, that part is kind of different. Like that there's. That they should not be complaining if people are going off and finding alternative news sources and then complaining about disinformation if they're the ones that have kind of driven people to those news sources.
I think this issue of partisanship or credibility, it's almost like picking your words, has existed since the inception of this country, and probably since people have been reporting on newsworthy episodes or events. So that's nothing new, but what's making it so dangerous today is the accelerated means of dissemination of irresponsible information, to put it to you politely. Mark Twain once said that if you don't read the news, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. And that's very true. But, the bottom line is that we have to figure out how we're going to address this and fix this going forward, because they are at the root of the problem that's tearing this country apart. I call them selective reporters. They seem to think they have the prerogative to just selectively choose what it is they want to speak to, and then the manner in which they want to speak to it, and skewing the truth, which is why I go back to this thing about this misinformation squad. What happened to that, folks? I think that was a great idea. For once, we were going to go in and start to hold accountable the people that disseminate information to this country. People in this country rely upon the media for their information today like never before. Would you agree?
Oh, for sure. And whether you're younger generation and you're getting all your news from, say, a TikTok or a YouTube, or you're sort of our generation that probably gets a lot from TV and more traditional news sources. Yeah, I mean, these are the blowhorns out there, right? What's the word I'm looking for? they're the ones out there that are blasting us with this info, and and they're the loudest voices. So you're gonna, that's what's being fed to everybody.
I mean, can you tell us a little bit about your show and some of the issues or topics you cover?
Yeah. So I got the shirt on. Yeah.
It's red. And it's red.
It is red, yeah.
It says something, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So, I try to cover a lot of things. Obviously, politics, it's a big driver here. And what you were talking about is this sort of the political division that we're in now is obviously one of the sort of big social problems that we deal with. So that comes up a lot. And so the basic theme is I go out and find researchers and scientists that are authors, or sometimes community leaders and faith leaders, and I talk to them about one of these issues. Either specifically the paper they wrote or a book they wrote, or I just introduce a topic and find somebody that I think is authoritative on that topic, and we kind of have a conversation. And so I've covered things like political polarization, which is obviously a big one in the news. I've also talked sort of about the both sidism, and that sometimes things really are abhorrent and it's okay that you take a side and things like that. So I've had the challenge is I'm trying to have this be, kind of a nonpartisan thing that can appeal to, people that specifically, I think it's going to appeal to people that are sort of center left or center right. I mean, I think if you're on the edge, you're probably going to be, he's not yelling about the other side enough. And so it's probably not going to, I've even had that kind of feedback. But that's kind of the goal. And so we'll sort of see that. And so far, the audience that have kind of come to me saying they're interested in it has sort of been that. So we'll see if that continues to be the case as I go forward. But
so let me ask you this, if I may, David. Do you speak to topics like what's going on at the border? Do you speak to topics like this? And see, today I asked the question, a very simple one. Who's supposed to benefit from this border policy? Just curious, especially in light of the fact that the FBI director came out a month ago in Senate hearings in Washington citing that our border is a threat to our national security. The fentanyl problem is no secret, right? We have illegal people coming into the country in excess of 5 million. Do you speak to this issue? And I'm still trying to figure out who's supposed to benefit from that for openers, or what's going on in our major cities. So tell us where you go with these topics.
Yeah, I don't tend to talk about or take a position on issues per se. I more look at the as an observer of how we deal with an issue like that, or how we are talking about it. So it's sort of a little bit meta in that regard. So, I'm not really in the business of trying to convince people or to change their mind. At least that's not in the context of this podcast. That's not what it's about. It's more about how are we talking about things like immigration and you ask a great question, like who is this benefiting? That's the kind of question that I would ask, or how are we talking about this, and who's, immigration is a great example of one of these situations or one of these issues that's nuanced, right? And, and it's also a situation where people tend to get very emotional about it. And many people that take a side don't actually know much about the issues, right? They know what their side says, and they know and so they just kind of go along. Well, what did my guy say? Okay, then I'll go for that. I like that policy. They don't really look at it too closely. And it's also a good example of one of these policies that is a classic sort of example of who's more afraid of it. So like people on the right tend to consider this a much more important issue than people on the left, right? They've decided other things are more important.
I think you might find there are more people, regardless of their political affiliation, that are concerned about this episode right now. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. I'm going to come back to this gentleman, Richard Beckemeyer, in 1 second. He has his own podcast. I would encourage you to tune in because it's quite obvious he's quite open-minded and discusses these issues that are plaguing the country in an intelligent manner. We'll be right back, guys. Stay with me. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. Okay, we're back, guys, and instead of calling David Richard, I'm going to call David from now on, I promise you. But we're going to continue this conversation, and a lot of it lends itself to the condition of the country, and a podcast David has decided to construct that addresses the media, some of what's going on in our media, which is ultimately the source, almost the sole source of our information. So I want to get back into this, David, though. My concern and the reason that's motivating me with this show deals with the future of our young people. Because I'm over the hump, David, to be very candid with you. I won't say I'm untouchable, but I'm almost bulletproof. And depending on your demographic, you probably fall into line with me. This is about the future of this country and this agenda that seems to be pervasive, which lends itself to destroying this country. It isn't one issue. There's no such thing as single causality. There won't be one single cause of this country going to its knees. It's going to be a multitude. Borders, cities, foreign policy, and I just love this economy we're living in, where we shut down the Keystone Pipeline, which caused this problem with the price of gasoline, compounded by borrowing $5 trillion. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a gentleman on this phone who's going to speak to this whole issue about the economy and the fallout of spending $5 trillion. I'm trying to figure out who is benefiting from that. I'm trying to figure out who benefits from the criminal element operating with impunity in our major cities. I'm really trying to connect some dots here. What I really want to do is offer everybody a solution to all of this, and it's really not that difficult, and they've created a situation, for example, at the border that's going to require us at some point, once there's a power shift, to shut the border so we can realign our assets and introduce the migration process into this country in a manner in which we can manage it. And I have to tell you something interesting. The year I was born, we had a population of 150 million. We're at 335 million. One thing I learned along the way here, David, was, and I keep calling you Richard, so you're allowed to hit me when you see me. What I learned, David, was, as things grow, they become exponentially more difficult to manage. I'm just looking at the way we are governing this country. And unfortunately, I'm not just pointing at the Democrats. I want to see what the Republicans are going to do when they get their at-bat. You guys want to get into the batting box? You're about to get it. I hope you're not going to sit on your thumbs. And I have to tell you something else. This whole issue at the border is on the cusp of treason. If you or I were to engage in an activity that threatened the security of this nation, they charge you with treason. You've been told by your FBI director that this is a threat to your national security. I don't know what else you need to hear to take a different stance on the border. And then they stand there and bold-faced lie to you that the border's not broken. You must have heard Mayorkas say that, right? I heard Jen Psaki say it was. I heard Mayorkas say it isn't. I don't know if Kamala Harris can put a sentence together to express to us what she thinks about the border. But the border's a hot topic, to be very candid with you. That and the city condition of the cities. And the tragic part about this, David, is even if the conservative element gets a hold of this government in 1 week, how do we roll back the clock on our major cities? I'm just curious. Or does everyone think this isn't important? Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Sorry, David.
Yeah, I think that the city's issue can be, this is also a little bit, sometimes can be overblown or can be, amplified by media as well, and to kind of get us focused on the actual, sort of what's really going on, keeping the temperature right. Like, is this what's the appropriate amount of outrage?
Is that comment made in reference to the borders, for example? Because the statistics that come to us regarding the border penetration, whether it's encountered or gotaways, is coming from Homeland Security, ironically, or governmental agencies. These aren't numbers that the media is making up. These numbers they regurgitate are numbers that are coming from credible source.
Yeah, well, the one I was thinking about is sort of the crime. I mean, we have to put that in perspective. I mean, crime has been going down for 30 years. And, we get these hype stories that crime is awful and so on. And we have to be a little careful to put that in perspective. And so I do worry about that one. I think, that one thing you mentioned regarding the immigration stuff and how one person said this, one person said that, other data was excluded. I mean, that's a great example of everybody has to be a little bit more critical. I think we have a civic duty to be critical of our own side when they're doing that stuff rather than just jumping on board with them. And so, I want to see that from both sides. I want to see, when your side is doing something like that and kind of being a little bit, and they all do it. They're politicians. They tell lies. They don't know their story. They change all the time. So your side's doing whatever side you're on. And I think we have a civic duty to call out our own side sometimes and focus on our own side sometimes when they're doing that. And I think more of that would maybe get them to be a little bit more, who would it? I don't know. We'll see. But I think that we do have a civic duty to do that. And we have a tendency not to do that because we get very tribal.
Yeah, David, when I speak to these topics, I don't speak to them as a politically affiliated person. I'm concerned about my children, to be very candid with you. I had them late in life. I don't have a big backside with them, not as long as I'd like. And I'm concerned about the young people here because I can tell you, I've had a phenomenal journey. I've had my share of adversity and disappointment, believe me, more than my share. But through it all, I have to tell you, I've had a life that's just been off the hook. Today, whether people want to think, and I know that we're listening to Hochul, for example, in New York, talk down the crime in New York. there are literally attacks on the subways every single day in the city of New York. That's irrefutable. The homicides are down. I can tell you that. I get the crime stats from a very dear friend who was former detective, chief of detectives in New York City. We're grabbing guns and on record numbers. 85% of them we're not prosecuting. That's the bail reform. Violent felony assaults are up dramatically. Robberies are up dramatically. Burglaries are up dramatically. Sexual assaults are up dramatically. And that's not just in the city of New York. That's across the board. So, my whole point is as we're supposed to continue to evolve, you're right, these numbers should go down. Maybe they're lower, I should say, lower than they were, say, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. I'm not sure. That I'd have to look into that because I was around in law enforcement in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But the bottom line is we're supposed to be the best we can be. I'm not dismissing the importance of comparison to prior times, but what we have right now is unacceptable, period. And it's driving a lot of the discussion today. People are afraid. I talk to friends of mine in New York City that are affluent that will not go out at night to eat. Stick-ups in broad daylight in Manhattan are not fiction. I know firsthand. Carjackings in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan are not fiction. I know for fact because of my own avenues into information. But I do think that if you follow, for example, what's going on in Chicago, they're saying 54 people are shot per week. So are we saying that like in decades ago, people were shot in that number in Chicago? Is that my understanding?
I think they were. And the thing is, it wasn't in the news the same way, right? I mean, this is part of the outrage overload problem. It's part of this outrage industry. They love that stuff, right? So they're going to try to scare people all the time. I mean, we were probably wrong to think we could just go out, in the 80s and 90s, but because it was more dangerous. But we did it because we didn't know it was that bad, right? But now we kind of know. So somehow it's gone the other way too far. I mean, somewhere in there, you're right. It's still unacceptable, and we have to work on this crime. But there is a little bit of now we're more afraid because they want us afraid. They want us afraid of everything all the time. And I think because that's how they get the viewership, right? They keep us afraid. They keep us agitated.
These are great points that you're making. And I do want to say one other thing because, the purpose of the show also is not to tell people what to think necessarily, but to give them food for thought. I say that all the time. I just want to give you some food for thought, and I encourage you to go out and do your own research, as I do. I'm an investigator by trade over 49 years. It's kind of second nature to me. I look and I look and I look, and I have an analytical brain. But I think you're bringing out some really good points. The fact that they do like to gaff you and drag you along. You're right about that. But here's the question. How do we fix this, David?
Yeah. And I talk to a lot of people, and I always ask that question, like, what are we going to do and how do we fix this? And I talk to, I also do so in addition to talking to all these experts, I've also spent a fair bit of time, and of course you're talking to people all the time, so you know what I'm talking about, but I do what I call man on the street interviews. So I'm kind of talking to ordinary people and kind of get their perspectives. And I try to go, across the spectrum, political spectrum, plus sort of generational. So I've talked to Gen Xers, Gen Zs, Gen Ys, all, millennials, and the whole bit. So, so I've tried to get, and so and the thing is that it's a little bit varied, right? I mean, I have had, it leans a little bit doomsday, right? I mean, even a lot of the experts are a little bit doomsday on this, right? And they kind of finish with, well, I have hope, or I'm not that optimistic, But, I think some stuff that has come up a lot, or something that you mentioned, something like the disinformation kind of thing, and some of this third party, more neutral, more, bipartisan is not really the right word, but like an independent review body of more of this that you could get, both for social media and potentially for more traditional media, something like that could potentially play into it a little bit. And of course, some people just go back, well, it's up to us, and we're going to have to individually take these things more seriously. And, something else you said about, going to, multiple places to look at a thing to see what the different views are and try to find a perspective on it. And that's really hard. That's more work, but that's the only way to get sort of a reasonable picture of things. Is you can't just trust one news source. You do have to kind of look around a little bit and then kind of use your own critical brain and thinking a little bit to say, does that one sound kind of crazy? Does that stand out? Is that an outlier? And is this one, now that I can kind of take these in the aggregate, what does this situation really look like? And that is a lot more work, right? I mean, that's going to require time on us.
Yeah, I think these are really good points. One of the things I find interesting today with the media in particular and one of our political entities is this fixation with Donald Trump. He's out of office, 20 months or so. I mean, at what point do we move on and allow the country to heal, which is what this country really has to do? And at what point does the rhetoric stop both sides, to be candid with you? This isn't a one-sided argument there. I just cited in the beginning of this thing, I'm listening to Hillary Clinton on one of these interviews talking about, the extreme right wing is already postured to interfere with the 2024 presidential election. And I don't know if you follow the podcast at all, but we had a gentleman on, Elliot Ackerman, about 2-3 weeks ago. And this is a very dangerous practice. This is kind of like Banana Republic type stuff we're doing, where we could end up in a civil and military standoff in our country. Keep this up, boys and girls. These are the smart people also. I don't know if you were around for John Kennedy. They coined the phrase, the best and the brightest. I'm looking at what the best and the brightest have done. And today, all of the best and the brightest, the Ivy Leaguers, what they missed in real life about the critical importance of being responsible before you speak or do something. Because you know what? I'm going to inherit that much of it. Our young people are going to inherit this much of it. And my thing with the show is to try to problem solve. What's your take on our foreign policy? Do you give it any thought, or do you have your own objective opinion?
Well, before I go there, I do want to go back a little bit to your question about sort of what do we do in hope and the generational thing and what we're going to give to our kids, because I think that's really important. And I will say that some of the hope, I've been encouraged by talking to young people. They seem a lot more engaged than I was kind of expecting, and they also seem to want to do things. And it's almost like the millennials are sort of already burnt out. They're like, we're over it, but it seems like this Gen Z generation is really wants to do things. So I'm encouraged by the talks I've had with folks from that generation. So, okay. So foreign policy. Well, I'm reluctant to jump in there. So I'm just not an expert on foreign policy.
Did you follow the withdrawal from Afghanistan? And I want to ask you a favor. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come right back, and we're going to follow up with this question with David. We'll be right back with you guys. Stay with us. Guys, we're back, and I have David Beckemeyer with me. David has his own podcast that lends itself to outrage with the media. It's a very interesting subject, I think, shared by many. We were just having a discussion about the foreign policy, and, David, responsibly you mentioned the fact that you're not that, I would say, up to speed with it, but you must have seen what transpired in Afghanistan's withdrawal. We left $85 billion of weaponry. We closed Bagram, which is critically important to that region of the world, not just Afghanistan. And more importantly, and perhaps most egregiously, we left these women and these young girls out in the cold again. So I give you that as an example. I know you're aware of that, and I've listened and spoken with a number of people on that. I'm trying to find one person that tells me there was merit in doing that other than this government.
Well, and I think it goes back to why we were there in the first place and how much money we spent to even go there and what we were doing and why were we there for as long as we were. I mean, I think whenever we were going to pull out, at that point, we were in so deep, there was no way to do it gracefully and prettier. And pretty. Could it have been better? Absolutely. But I mean, I think we have to, like I said, also kind of put it in perspective. Whenever you're in that quagmire like that, when you get out, it's going to be bad. I mean, because no one's going to just let you walk out and take everything you want to take, right? I mean, as soon as you start to roll out, that hands the power back to the bad guys, and they're not going to just let you do it your way. Now, again, how much opportunity was there to negotiate a better deal and things like that? Maybe, but at some point we were going to have to get out. So probably whoever finally had to bite that bullet and eat it was going to pay for it because it wasn't going to be pretty. But yeah, it could have been handled better for sure. But like I said, I go back a little bit to what were we doing there in the first place, and how did we find ourselves in that
and
mess?
That's a very critical and important point you just brought out, because that's an exercise in failed foreign policy, insinuating ourselves into a region of the world that there's a total disconnect in every possible concept, and likely that it was driven by money. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But motoring ahead, I hate to say this, but Donald Trump had the means to step out. And I'm not a Donald Trump supporter, so let me be clear about that, but I believe in telling the truth and giving credit where it was due. Trump was going to position troops in Bagram. I've listened to a number of people, including Elliot Ackerman. They could have controlled that country with 2,500 troops and drones. That's all it comes down to. We ended up biting off more than we really should have. I agree with you, David, in that aspect, but we were committed. And the key is not to just totally pull the plug. And I do believe there was a more graceful way we could have extricated ourselves from this whole exercise, which was ill-conceived 20 years earlier. You're right about that. We just, what's interesting is that wasn't the Democrats that did that, by the way. That was the Republicans. That was Herbert Walker Bush, whose service and love to this country you cannot question. Followed up by George W.
To be fair, it was bipartisan at the time. I mean, everybody decided we were going to do that.
But not 91, though. I think that was under George W.
The first one. Yeah,
exactly.
Right,
I mean, that's when we first insinuated ourselves with Margaret Thatcher in our ear. That was ill-conceived. And then it was questions as to why he didn't take out Saddam Hussein. There's an expression, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. But moving ahead, when George W. got in there, I'm trying to understand why this was such a threat to us, why it took a year and a half for you to bomb them. We were in Afghanistan in 2 weeks. There's a whole another story attached to this that we're entitled to know. But more importantly, look what it did to a generation of young men and women in this country coming back in body bags. And those who have come back mentally and physically a mess. They're killing themselves at 22 or 25 a day. Under Obama, with Shinseki, they failed in the Veterans Administration, and we're still not up to snuff. We're busy taking care of other people coming across the border illegally. This is what really amps me up. We're taking care of them. We don't take care of our veterans, our homeless, our mentally ill. We don't take care of the elderly properly, right? Or our children. So just understand what my whole thought process is, which is quite, I have to say, encompassing. My brain just, and this is the thing that really gets me. And I tell people this. I go off on these tangents all over the place, and they all intersect with the future of the young people in this country. And you're speaking about these generations of children. They're entitled to an explanation. At some point in time, I'd love the opportunity to go into an academic environment to begin with. Not contentious, but to listen and to learn from them. And then to speak to them and explain to them, you're entitled to something better than this. Be part of a change that's good for this country. Because, all we're getting back in many areas from our young people with this confusion and this loss and belief in our leadership is pushback. And it's not in a good form. We need to engage them much the same way you're speaking to. And I think you agree with that.
Yeah. And I want to circle back, because Donald Trump has come up a couple times, and I think that's an absolute sort of prototype, perfect example of kind of what we're talking about with this outrage stuff. On the one hand, I think there are a bunch of times when people that probably would have, just almost couldn't look at the guy, they hated him so bad, probably would agree with him on policy things and didn't even know that they agree with him on policy things. And I think likewise is true as well. I think there's times when Donald Trump was preaching, in fact, there's studies that show this, that Donald Trump was sort of preaching something center left or even farther than that. And people that sort of said, I have these strong ideological views. Oh, but Trump said it, then I'm okay with it. So, that's a good example of, looking inwardly sometimes and saying it's not, that how we've separated our policy positions from this outrage, hate, sort of moral positions that we can't even see it when we agree. And we can't even, so it's like it's not even about policy anymore sometimes. And I think Trump, is sort of another example of this kind of example of this aggrievement, right? That we all feel aggrieved and we're all trying to get revenge. And it was also like a classic example of how the news media, it's a perfect example of how the news media leverages this stuff. Nobody loved Donald Trump more than the left-leaning media, right? They absolutely love the guy because, that is he's a ratings machine for them. You could say the same thing about Obama for the right side, right? They absolutely loved Obama, right? That was a moneymaker for the right. So it kind of works, both ways. And I think to some degree, Obama is how we ended up with Trump, right? You just get these people raged and then there's a backlash. And then Trump is kind of how we got Biden, right? You get these people enraged and they want to backlash and you end up like we are now. And the experts that I'm talking to say, we're in it. Like, this is how it's going to be. We're going to have these back and forth swings like that. At each swing of that pendulum, our moral standards change. What was immoral before, now we say it's moral because we're saying it's for our side. It's for the good of these moral intentions that we all think we have the founders' intentions in mind. We all think we're speaking for the good, the best of the country and this kind of thing. And now anything becomes on the table, right? Nothing's off limits. And each cycle, it gets crazier and crazier. And I think Trump and Obama, to some degree, are perfect examples of that.
The commonality between the two of them, right? They both polarize this nation.
Right.
That's the truth of the matter. Mr. Obama decided he was going to redefine this nation. And then even worse, the same bad foreign policy that we had in the Middle East, he had here domestically. He insinuated himself into incidents in Boston with the police when they were trying to protect his college buddy from getting hurt. He labeled him derogatorily, then had to have a beer with him. Stay out of it. Then we had Ferguson
Right.
with Michael Brown. We dispatched
Right.
Eric Holder, right? We predetermined the guilt of this police officer before we even started the investigation, only to find out, in fact, that Michael Brown was the bad guy here. Again, Mr. Obama, you know, he spoke to this young progressive movement. I think we're all aware of that. And now the Democratic Party is suffering from it because I know you see the same thing I do. They're fractured. They're severely fractured. They have to figure out how to heal. And I tell people this, regardless of your political views, we need healthy political entities to balance out. That's what the government's built on. In the federal government, it's the three branches, right? Balance of power. It's the same thing with these two political entities. But, you know, the
Right.
thing that really is interesting about your observations about Trump, which is spot on, you know, he did things, whether people like to admit this or not, that were in the best interests of this country, wanting to bring back manufacturing, managing the southern border. He addressed NATO with the disproportionate amount of spending when you, in fact, were getting services from an entity that we were protecting you from. He spoke about a number of issues here. He brought the unemployment rate to the lowest it's ever been in 40 years with the black community. The problem is that all went tone deaf because of his lack of demeanor. We didn't send him to finishing school, David. I think you'll agree with that. He polarized us. My fear today is that, and this is the thing I learned about human nature, there was so much animosity, as you mentioned, right, towards Trump that people were blinded by it. So they just wanted to discard him, and they did, and in came Joe Biden. I'm not going to critique this man because it wouldn't be kind. I don't like liars. I don't like hearing gasoline was $5 when you came into office, or any other number of fairy tales about who's steering our economy, Mr. Putin. The reason you have high gas prices or your inflation rate. So you're telling me, Mr. Biden, that you surrendered a position to a foreign entity, adversarial in nature, that could compromise our culture. Is that what you told me, Mr. Biden? This another. Let me go back to Trump, though. Let me tell you what's going on now. People are going like this. They remember their stock portfolios and the overall condition of this country during Trump, and they're prepared to dismiss his bad behavior to get somebody like him back. He's not the answer, David. I think you'll agree with me with that, because we don't need anybody to polarize the country and build the hatred up any further. We need to ask the Pelosi's, the McConnells, the Trumps, the Clintons, everybody stand aside, and let's take a look at a Tulsi Gabbard, for example, or a DeSantis, or Kirsten Noem, or Nikki Haley, people that have some common sense, logic, and decency in their conversation, which is a big part of the problem. That's all left the conversation. And by the way, our children are witnessing this. So they're going to think that this is our norm. We're going to go to a quick break, David. I'm going to come right back to you, buddy. Just stick with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. I have David Beckemeyer, who has his own podcast. I would suggest you look into it. It's pretty intelligent, has a real interesting perspective on the media and perhaps how we're being manipulated a little bit and fed off of, and I think it's just worth looking into. David, I want to surrender the floor to you to ask you to speak to anything in particular that you'd like to bring to light.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to close with. I had one of my guests was Rush Arvania, which is he's a Freemason. He's like he was a Grand Master of the California Freemasons, but he wrote a book about civility, and he runs a program, and I think it's called the Worldwide Civility Council, and he has a thing they call Certified Civil and some other things, and I think that's a place to start too. Is like, you know, we talk about, you know, we can have disagreements without becoming uncivil, and I think that's something we need. I think that's in line with what you're saying as well. That, you know, these and I think we talked about Trump and Obama a lot. And another thing they had in common was that, you know, both sides tended to be reluctant to call their own person out when they were doing, like a lot of things you mentioned about Obama. You didn't see the left call him out on that very much. Likewise, some of the stuff that Trump would do, you wouldn't see the right call him out. So I think both of them were examples of where we need to do that. We have that civil obligation to sometimes call out people on our own side, but do so in a civil way. And when you're interacting, I want to, you know, have us start seeing our adversaries as human again. Like, we may disagree, and we can disagree, you know, loudly, but it doesn't have to become uncivil, and we have to still see them as human. Like, they want the same things we want. Where we both talked a lot about, you know, a lot of this is for our children. Well, both sides want that. I mean, we have that in common. Like, we want a better future for our children.
Yeah, David,
so
not to interrupt you or to contradict you, but I'm not sure when they open their mouths that they are thinking about our kids. I don't. I'm not sure that you're right, though. Yeah,
I'm not talking politicians. I'm talking about us as people.
And the media. But David, the media as well. Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're thinking 2 seconds worth about the young people here. No. Because they're taking us on a collision course.
But I think when we engage with people on the other side, we have to remember that they're human. Like I said, media, that's a whole nother story. But I just want us to at least see the humanity in our adversaries if we're having political discussions with our neighbors, with our other people in our community, and so on. And that's a thing that I'm kind of driving towards, is let's keep it civil, and let's remember that our adversaries are also human beings that do have some things in common. We both want a better future for our kids. We want good schools. We want good roads. There are things we have in common.
I agree with that. I say it a different way, though. I say you should never invalidate the thoughts of people that are contrary to yours, because that's how you learn from people. But that lends itself to being a secure individual where you're not threatened by ideas that don't align. I mean, this is about learning. This is about teaching. These are concepts we should be teaching in schools to our children, about opening your mind up, be secure. Maybe you'll learn something here. I always say I love smart people because they're the ones who teach me. But these are things that, they're not resonating enough, because I think we're being torn apart here. And I go back and say to you what I said in the beginning: the media is leading the charge, and I don't want to contradict you, but I don't necessarily agree with you that they're concerned about the young people in this country the same way you and I are, because there's no evidence of that. Nobody seems to be able to get a hold of their tongue. Period. The buffoonery just never seems to cease, and it's on both sides. I listen to Sean Hannity, just begrudgingly, but Sean Hannity makes some very valid, truthful points. There's nothing good, and this is about decency, or what you just spoke about, ridicule or demeaning or defiling anybody and making your point. And they do that consistently with the president. If you're going to criticize constructively. And what you just mentioned is the same thing I say. Decency and civility have left our conversations, David. That's the reality of it here today. And it's incumbent upon the leadership, both in government and in the media, to change the conversation. That's what this is about, to hit right on what you just said. We don't have to be adversaries because we don't agree. That's the bottom line. And I've had a load of people in my life that I wasn't necessarily aligned with politically or in any number of capacities. It doesn't mean you're my enemy. It just means we're different. We need to teach people it's okay to be different. That's what makes this country so wonderful. It's an interesting discussion because of how it impacts, our culture long term. We've got to change this conversation. We've got to reinstill a different thought process in our people to make them understand it's okay we don't agree. But there are some issues here that are nagging us today, and I don't want to go back to this because I don't want to try to open up another conversation about the borders and the cities and the economy. Look, I'm not the sharpest guy on the planet. I never said I was, but I didn't fall off the back of an Apple truck either. And I've watched this government go into this spending habit. I don't understand what that was about. And now all of a sudden we're in an economic freefall practically, and we're realizing that spending $5 trillion wasn't the best idea. And second day into office, the first day, he shuts down the Keystone XL pipeline, and they're talking about shutting down Line 5. And now we're going to Venezuela or to Iran or these other countries that are our adversaries to use their oil in our cars, pay through the nose for it. Did I miss something here? And I go back and I want to just say this. We need leadership. And my impressions of John Kennedy, contrary to all of the critique of his personal life, which I'm not interested in, I think this guy was a phenomenal leader. The thing that came away with this man is that when he spoke to our country, you felt like he spoke to everyone. Not the people that donated to him, not the Democrats, not the Republicans. I think he embraced this country. And what was so interesting is this whole country was enamored with him. Why? It's because he was a leader. And that's left the conversation, David. I don't know what your feeling is on that. I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to end.
Yeah, well, that's what you're absolutely right. That's what's missing today. I don't know where that kind of a leader that people trust is. Where is, I don't know, Walter Cronkite as an example, but as you say, John Kennedy as an example, or even a John McCain for that matter. I mean, there's no room for a maverick like that anymore. Where are these people that we can all agree we have some confidence in what they're saying? We respect them. Like, those people don't exist in our society today, and that scares the heck out of me.
maybe they're harder to find because of the exponential growth of this country, and maybe we've gotten too big to manage, you know. And my final question for the day, which is rhetorical, is there a certificate of occupancy on the United States, or are we going to turn into India and China? Because it looks like no one's giving this concept any thought. And we're at 335 million we can account for. And I guarantee you there's a lot more than that. Guys, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I especially would like to thank you, David Beckemeyer, for your thoughts. I encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, for everyone to plug into his podcast. Deals with outrage in the media. He's not contentious, I will say that to you. Outrage Overload is how you'll find David. Anything else you want to say about people being able to find you, David?
I know, outrageoverload.net. So that's our website, and you can pretty much find everything about us from that.
There you go. Thank you, guys. Thank you, David.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you, Lou.
My pleasure. Thank you. That's it, guys.